In January 1990, a jury in Los Angeles returned its verdict in the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history. 6 years, $16 million in prosecution costs, 450 children interviewed, 7 teachers indicted, more than 300 counts of child molestation filed. And at the end of all of it, after the testimony and the evidence, and the years of headlines, and the national conversation about satanic ritual abuse, and hidden underground tunnels and photographs that were never found, the verdict was not guilty. Not guilty on 52 counts against Peggy McMartin Bucky. Not guilty on the majority of counts against her son Ray. The jury deadlocked on 13 remaining charges against Ray, and when a second trial was held on those, he was acquitted on all of them too. In the end, not one person was convicted of a single crime at the McMartin preschool. Outside the courthouse that day, 500 people were gathered with signs. The signs read, "We believe the children." They had believed the children for 6 years. The acquittals did not change that. Many of them went home still believing. Some of them in interviews conducted years and then decades later said they believed it still. This is not a story about whether Ray Bucky was guilty or innocent. The courts answered that question twice, and the answer was the same both times. This is a story about what happened in the space between a mother's phone call to a police station in August 1983 and those 500 people on the courthouse steps in January 1990. About how a community built something, an edifice of accusation and investigation and testimony and absolute certainty out of nothing. And about what it cost the people who were standing where that building came down. To understand what happened in Manhattan Beach in 1983, you have to understand something about the America that surrounded it. Manhattan Beach was not a place that looked like it was capable of this kind of panic. It was a prosperous, sun-washed community on the Los Angeles coast. The kind of neighborhood where the houses were well maintained, and the schools were well funded, and the parents were educated professionals who read parenting books and worried about their children in the careful, attentive way of people with the time and resources to worry carefully. The McMartin Preschool, founded in the early 1960s by a woman named Virginia McMartin, was one of the most respected child care institutions in the area. Families sent their children there. Then they sent their children's children. It was the kind of place that accumulates trust across generations. But 1983 was a particular moment in American culture. The country was in the middle of a sustained and anxious conversation about child abuse, not because child abuse had suddenly become more common, but because the conversation about it had finally broken into the open after decades of silence. Books were being published. Television programs were airing. A new framework was emerging in therapeutic psychology around the idea that traumatic memories could be repressed, buried so deeply that the person who experienced the trauma had no conscious recollection of it, and that specialized therapy could bring those memories to the surface. The concept of recovered memory was not yet fully contested. The techniques that would later be exposed as capable of producing false memories in highly suggestible subjects, including young children, were being practiced by therapists across the country as though they were established and reliable. The field was new. The confidence was enormous. If you were a parent in Manhattan Beach in the fall of 1983, this was the water you were swimming in. You were living in a community that prided itself on attentiveness to its children. You were reading about child abuse in magazines and seeing it discussed on the evening news. You believed because the culture around you was telling you to believe that children did not make up stories about abuse, that their testimony was uniquely credible, that the role of a good parent and a good community was to believe the children above all else. And then the letter arrived. In August 1983, a woman named Judy Johnson went to the Manhattan Beach Police Department. Her 2.5-year-old son, she said, had been abused by Ray Buckey, a teacher at the McMartin preschool. Ray was the only male teacher at the school. The grandson of its founder, a young man in his mid-20s who had worked there for several years. Ray was arrested. He was released for lack of evidence. The police chief of Manhattan Beach then made a decision that set everything else in motion. He sent a form letter to approximately 200 families whose children attended or had attended McMartin. The letter informed them that an investigation was underway. It asked them to question their children about possible molestation. It listed specific acts the parents might ask about touching, photographing. It told them to contact the police or a private clinic called Children's Institute International if they found anything concerning. The letter also asked parents not to discuss it with anyone outside their immediate family. Within days, everyone in Manhattan Beach knew. Think about what it means to receive a letter like that. You are a parent. The letter is from the police department on official letterhead. It tells you that the school where your child has spent their days, the school you chose carefully, the school you trusted is being investigated for child molestation. And it asks you to go home and question your child. What do? You go home. You sit down with your child. You ask in the careful, loving way of a frightened parent whether anything happened at school that made them feel uncomfortable. Whether anyone touched them in a way that didn't feel right, whether there were any secrets. Children are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional state of the adults around them. They know when a question carries weight, when the answer matters in ways they cannot fully understand when something is being asked that requires a particular kind of response. A 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old. These are children who are still learning what the world expects of them, who are practiced at reading the faces of the adults who love them and finding the response that brings relief to those faces. Some children said yes, some said no, some said yes when asked again. The parents who heard yes called the police. The police referred them to Children's Institute International. Children's Institute International was a private therapeutic clinic in Los Angeles. It was hired by the prosecution to conduct interviews with the children whose parents had reported concerns. The lead interviewer was a woman named Kee McFarlane. McFarlane was not a licensed psychologist. She was a social worker with experience in child advocacy. She used anatomically detailed dolls. She used puppets. She used games and role play and the language of secrets, asking children to be helpers and to show the adults what had happened by playing with the dolls. She told children that other children had already told her things. She praised children who described abuse and redirected children who denied it. The techniques she used were not invented for McMartin. They reflected the therapeutic consensus of the early 1980s around how to interview children who might have been abused, a consensus built on the genuine and important insight that children needed safe, age-appropriate interview environments, but which had moved in practice into territory where the line between uncovering real memories and creating false ones had become dangerously blurred. Over the course of several months, McFarlane and her colleagues at CII interviewed approximately 400 children. Their conclusion, roughly 360 of those children had been sexually abused. 360 children at one preschool by a staff of fewer than 10 people. As the interviews continued, the stories the children told expanded. Not just touching rituals, not just the classroom tunnels beneath the school, not just the teachers strangers brought in from outside. Children described being taken to cemeteries, to car washes, to churches where animals were killed and their blood was consumed. They described teachers flying through the air. They described a game called Naked Movie Star. They described things that, if taken literally, described not a preschool, but a satanic cult operating in the middle of a residential neighborhood in one of the most densely populated areas of the United States, without attracting any notice from anyone. The parents listened to these accounts and believed them. The investigators documented them and believed them. The district attorney received them and believed them. No one found any physical evidence. Not a photograph, not a piece of clothing, not a tunnel entrance, not a bone from a sacrificed animal, not a single piece of the physical world that would have had to exist if what the children were describing had actually happened. The absence of physical evidence was explained away. The children had been so thoroughly traumatized, it was said that they could not be expected to produce reliable descriptions of time and place. The sophistication of the abusers was such that they had managed to leave no trace. The tunnels must be there. The investigators simply had not looked in the right places. In 1985, approximately 50 parents arrived at the McMartin preschool with shovels and a backhoe. The school had been ordered to close. The building was vacant. The parents had come to find the tunnels. They dug. They found the remains of a tortoise. They found some broken toys. They found the things that end up beneath the foundations of buildings, debris artifacts of ordinary life accumulating over decades. They found no tunnels. They announced that the tortoise remains were evidence of animal sacrifice. The excavation was photographed and filmed. The images ran in newspapers and on television. If you saw those images without context, 50 adults digging urgently in the ground near a shuttered preschool, you might have thought you were watching people search for something they had every reason to believe was there. And in a sense, you would have been right. They had every reason to believe by that point. The believing had been going on for 2 years. It had been validated by the police, by therapists, by the district attorney, by the national media that had descended on Manhattan Beach to cover what had become the most high-profile child abuse case in American history. The believing had built something. An architecture of certainty so solid that a hole in the ground full of broken toys could be made to fit inside it. The tunnels were not there. A team of archaeologists hired after the school was finally demolished in 1990 confirmed this definitively. They found no evidence of any underground structure beyond the building's ordinary foundation. But the excavation had happened in 1985. The trial did not begin until 1987. By the time the archaeologists rendered their conclusion, the case had already cost the Bucky family years of their lives, and the community of Manhattan Beach years of its sense of itself. The trial of Peggy McMartin Bucky and her son Ray began in April 1987. Ray had been in jail since 1984. Held on bail, he could not meet awaiting a trial that kept being delayed. He was 28 when he was arrested. He was 31 when the trial finally began. He had spent 3 years in custody before a single day of evidence was presented to a jury. 3 years in a cell. While the investigation continued outside, and the accusations grew more elaborate, and the national media ran story after story about satanic ritual abuse at American preschools. while his grandmother in her 80s sat under a cloud of accusation she had done nothing to earn, while his mother, who had worked alongside him at the school for years, waited for a proceeding that would not begin for 3 more years from the day they were first charged. The preliminary hearing alone, the proceeding before the trial, lasted 18 months and produced 65,000 pages of transcript. The hearing itself became a spectacle covered by the Los Angeles media as a daily serial with reporters camped outside the courthouse and television cameras trained on the witnesses as they arrived and departed. The city was watching. The country was watching. And what they were watching in the framing of the coverage was not a proceeding in which guilt had yet to be established. It was the methodical unveiling of an already established truth. Peggy McMartin Buckey, 60 years old, had dedicated her professional life to the education of young children. She had worked at the school her mother founded for decades. She had, by any account from families who were not caught up in the accusations, been exactly the kind of teacher you wanted for your child patient. Caring, experienced, the sort of person who remembered children's names years after they had moved on from her classroom. The prosecution presented its case over the course of more than a year. The interview tapes from Children's Institute International were played for the jury. And here something shifted. The jury watched the tapes. They watched McFarland sit across from small children and ask leading questions, suggest answers, praise descriptions of abuse, and express disappointment when children denied it. They watched the technique, and they saw what the technique was doing. Jury foreperson Louise Chang said afterward, "The interview tapes were too biased, too leading. That was the main crux of it." Another juror was more direct. "Whether I believe he did it and whether it was proven are two very different things." The jury acquitted on 52 counts. It deadlocked on 13. A second trial on the deadlocked counts ended in acquittal on all of them. Judy Johnson, the woman who had made the original accusation, the woman whose phone call to the Manhattan Beach Police in August 1983 had set 6 years of investigation and prosecution and national panic into motion, had died in 1986, in the middle of the preliminary hearings of complications from alcoholism. She had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The psychosis had been documented. The prosecutors knew about the diagnosis. The jury was never told. Ray Buckey walked out of the courthouse in 1990 a free man in the legal sense. He was 33 years old. He had spent 5 years in custody for crimes that 2 juries concluded had not been proven. He later changed his name and moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he built a quiet life. His attorney, Danny Davis, said he was the most heroic client he had ever defended, not only because he was innocent, but because he endured what was done to him with a quiet dignity that the circumstances did not require of him and that most people could not have maintained. Davis also said something else that has stayed with me. He said whether he did it and whether it was proven are two very different things. A juror had said the same. The phrasing is careful. Careful in the way that people are careful when they are trying to navigate the distance between what they believe and what the evidence established. What the evidence established in 2 trials was that the charges had not been proven. What people believed in many cases did not change. Peggy McMartin Buckey developed agoraphobia after the trial, a fear of open spaces, of the exposure that the proceedings had visited on her. She spent the years that remained to her largely inside. She died in 2000 in the house she rarely left. Her mother's school was gone. Her son had rebuilt himself under a different name in a different state. Her own name remained attached in any search of the public record to the most infamous child abuse trial in American history, a trial in which she had been acquitted of every charge. Virginia McMartin, the founder of the school, was 83 years old when the charges were finally dismissed against her. She had spent the last decade of her life under the shadow of accusations she never stopped denying. She died in 1995. The school she had spent 30 years building had been demolished. 9 preschools and daycare centers in the Manhattan Beach area went out of business during and after the McMartin investigation. The teachers and workers associated with them, people who had done nothing who were connected to the hysteria, only by proximity, faced accusations that followed them for years. Background checks, community whisper campaigns. The particular difficulty of rebuilding a professional life when you have been publicly associated with child abuse, even when no charges were ever filed against you. In 2005, one of the children who had been interviewed by CI, now an adult, gave an interview to a reporter. He said that he had lied, not deliberately, not maliciously. He had been 3 years old when he was interviewed, and he had done what 3-year-olds do when they understand that the adult across from them needs a particular kind of answer. He had given them what they needed. I said what I needed to say. He told the reporter. I had no idea what I was saying. McMartin did not happen in isolation. That is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with. While the McMartin trial was making its slow way through the Los Angeles courts, similar cases were spreading across the country. In Jordan, Minnesota, in 1983, 24 adults were accused of sexually abusing children in an organized ring. The accusations included children being taken to locations for group abuse sessions, precisely the kind of organized predation that McMartin had described. All charges were eventually dropped or resulted in acquittals. In Kern County, California, just a few hours from Manhattan Beach, 36 adults were convicted of child sexual abuse in cases that used similar interview techniques to those at CII. Many of those convictions were later overturned. In a daycare center in Malden, Massachusetts, a man named Gerald Amiro was convicted and imprisoned in a case where prosecutors had consulted with the McMartin legal team. He spent years fighting for exoneration. The accusations of satanic ritual abuse at daycare centers and preschools, fueled by the same therapeutic frameworks, the same interview techniques, the same cultural panic, appeared in state after state. Television programs covered the cases with the same mixture of horror and certainty that had surrounded McMartin from the beginning. A 1988 manual for therapists working with children described the signs that a child had been involved in satanic ritual abuse. The manual was used in training sessions across the country. Approximately 1 million people, by some estimates, were falsely accused of child abuse during the years of the Satanic Panic. Many of them were investigated. Many lost their jobs and their professional reputations. Some were convicted and imprisoned. Andrew Jr. Chandler, a daycare bus driver in Madison County, North Carolina, was sentenced to consecutive life sentences in 1987 and remained incarcerated for decades, his case among the hardest to revisit, because the system that had created it was deeply reluctant to fully acknowledge what it had done. The techniques developed and deployed at McMartin, the anatomically detailed dolls, the suggestive questioning, the therapeutic framework that treated a child's denial of abuse as itself a symptom of abuse, these techniques were exported and used across the country before anyone in a position of authority slowed down enough to ask whether they were producing truth or producing testimony. What they were producing in case after case was testimony. That is not the same thing. I want to say something about the 500 people outside the courthouse with their signs. They were not wrong to love their children. They were not wrong to have been frightened 6 years earlier when a letter arrived from the police department telling them that the school they trusted might not be safe. They were not wrong to have wanted someone to be held responsible if their children had been hurt. The desire to protect a child from harm is one of the most fundamental human impulses there is, and nothing that happened in Manhattan Beach between 1983 and 1990 changes that. What happened, what the McMartin case is actually about, when you get beneath the headlines and the legal arguments and the archaeological reports, is what becomes possible when that impulse is met by a system that does not know how to contain it. When a police department sends a letter that plants a question in 200 families simultaneously. When a therapeutic clinic uses techniques that produce the memories the clinic is looking for. When a prosecution decides that the absence of physical evidence is not a problem to be solved, but an inconvenience to be explained. When a media environment covers the accusations as established fact before any of them have been tested in court. None of those people set out to destroy the lives of the Bucky family. The police chief who sent the letter thought he was protecting children. McFarland thought she was uncovering abuse. The prosecutors thought they were pursuing justice. The parents outside the courthouse thought they were standing up for their children. The distance between what they thought they were doing and what they actually did is the thing that makes this case so hard to hold. It would be easier if someone had lied. If someone had known the tunnels were not there and said they were. If someone had known the children were not abused and pretended otherwise. But that is not what happened. What happened was that a community wanted very badly to believe, something wanted it for reasons that were not unreasonable, in a moment that was not paranoid by the standards of the time, and the wanting was strong enough to build an entire structure out of nothing. A structure that sent people to prison, that demolished a school, that spent $16 million of public money and 6 years of court time on accusations that 2 juries concluded had not been proven, and that sent 500 people to the courthouse steps on the day of the acquittals, certain that the system had failed their children. Some of them are still certain. The tunnels were not there. The cameras were not there. The animals were not sacrificed, and the rituals were not performed, and the underground chambers where the children said terrible things happened did not exist beneath the foundation of a preschool on a residential street in Manhattan Beach, California. What existed was the fear, and the fear was real. And real fear, given the right conditions and the wrong tools, can build things that are very difficult to take apart. Even after the verdict comes in, even after the archaeologists publish their report, even after the child who said he lied looks back at what he said when he was 3 years old and tries to explain it to a world that built so much on what he told them.